When I started this channel 4 years ago, it was, amongst other things, a way to kind of capture all of my recollections about my own personal gaming experience, kind of for the sake of my own sense of posterity. And as I was cleaning out a closet last weekend, I found my old Sega Game Gear, and it occurred to me, I've never talked about the Game Gear, I've never talked about my memories, and I've certainly never given my thoughts about any Game Gear games. So I figured, why not come on and do that with this video. I got the Game Gear probably in the early spring or summer of 1991. And at that time, I mean, the system seemed really amazing. I got the Game Gear actually before I got the TurboGrafx 16 or even the Sega Genesis. So this was, in effect, my next step beyond Nintendo. And I remember sort of going up to my room. I had this little alcove, and I sat there. I actually got the power supply, which I want to believe was a separate item, and plugged it into the wall and started playing Columns. Columns was the pack-in game, and I remember I had the air conditioning really blasting, and I just sat there for hours playing Columns with this sort of cold air blowing upon me. It was a great memory, and I had never played Columns up to that point. And I remember liking it because at that point in my life, I had never really done well with Tetris. I didn't quite, I don't know, have the spatial reasoning or the skill or whatever to really understand how to play Tetris well. And, it was only later in life that I realized what a brilliant game Tetris was, but I was really able to play Columns well. It was a simpler game, and I just fell in love with this version of Columns. I know it's not the best one. Probably the Genesis one was better. I think there was a Super Columns also on the Game Gear that was probably better than this, but this was my first, like I said, move beyond Nintendo. And I think the interesting thing about the Sega Game Gear, particularly back in those days without the internet, without really any way to independently verify any of the claims, you really did think that the Game Gear was a portable Genesis, that it was, the Sega Genesis that you can take on the road, and of course it was in color, and the Game Boy wasn't, as you saw in those commercials. So when I got it home that weekend, I felt like I don't know, I'd won the lottery. I have this little Genesis in my hand. And as a kid, without at that point having played the Sega Genesis, I was completely in awe of the system, especially when I put in Sonic the Hedgehog. And Sonic the Hedgehog, as I've mentioned I think a few times before here on this channel, was a really big deal when it came out. Having come from Mario on the NES, Sonic was literally bigger, bolder, and faster, and so it represented, I think, for those of us who were kids back then, that really qualitative leap forward. It was before the Super Nintendo. You have to understand that you saw Sonic before you saw Super Mario World, and so it was, for at least my circle of friends, it was the vanguard of technology at that point. Again, not knowing PC or anything else, it was like, wow, if you had Sonic on the Genesis, you would reach the, quote, the proverbial next level. So to pop this into the Game Gear and play Sonic on the Game Gear, now, this was not the first Sonic that I played. I did play the Genesis version of Sonic at a friend's house. So, obviously, this does not stack up to the Sega Genesis Sonic the Hedgehog, but to have it in a portable format, and to be playing this in my little air-conditioned alcove, going back between this and Columns, it was a big deal. It just, after my marathon playthrough of Columns, to put this in, and, it had the music, it had the Green Hill Zone, that I recall from the Genesis game, and it's funny looking back. This is not a very good game, and I honestly don't really, outside of nostalgia reasons, enjoy it. It's got some slowdown. It's not, I don't know, it just doesn't feel as accurate. And of course, playing it on my Game Gear still works, but the screen is a little beat up. So yeah, and even on emulators, it just doesn't feel as good as Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis. But these two games occupied a lot of my time, and it was certainly a qualitative leap, at least visually at that time, over the Game Boy, and felt like a leap over the NES, even though that was somewhat of an illusion. So these are the first two games that I had. And it's now that my memory gets a little murky, because the next game I can remember playing is Batman Returns. And I came back to this game for the purposes of this video and was not particularly thrilled with it, but I guess that movie had come out, or was coming out. Somehow I thought Batman Returns might have been 92, but whatever the case is, this is the next game I have any significant memories with. I don't know the chronology. And it was a serviceable Batman game. Of course, Batman games were not that great back in the day. They had very good music. Some of the Sunsoft Batman games, I believe, on the NES, certainly the one on the PC Engine had a great soundtrack. So, yeah, this was okay. It was, graphically, I would say, probably a little bit better than many Game Gear games. But as far as gameplay, it's a little on the repetitive side. Just kind of a pound the A button type of game, beat 'em up with some difficulty spikes. And, you could swing a little bit. Not great, but of course, when you're a kid and you've only got a handful of games, you spend a lot of time with them. So I probably put my paces in with Batman Returns, but I do not believe I beat it. Now, another one of my early-ish Game Gear memories was Sonic 2. So, we're probably into 1992 here. Again, the memory not really putting this in the perfect chronology, but at least as far as my own experience goes, I remember almost kind of going back and forth between Sonic 1 and Sonic 2 for a while, trying to beat one and then beat the other. And it was with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 that kind of the luster kind of came off the Game Gear a little bit. I remember Sonic 2 on the Game Gear being, having much shorter levels than Sonic 1, being a little bit easier. And I always felt something was off about it. I mean, I had fun with it, and I had some gimmicks, like the sort of mining cart and stuff like that. But having gone back to play it for this video, it, and to a certain extent the first Sonic game, felt lazy in spots. It's like the level design was not consistent. On the one hand, the games were very effective in impressing me as a kid and making it seem like I got my money's worth with the system, or my parents' money's worth. But, coming back to it as an adult, there's really very little redeeming these games. So I of course, back then you didn't realize that these games had come out on the Sega Master System, and I think that when you consider that fact, you can say to yourself, well, hey, these are pretty good approximations of Sonic on that aging hardware. But, the Game Gear was supposed to be the future, and Sonic 2 just really doesn't do it for me now, and was sufficient for having a good time as a kid. But I had played the real Sonic 2. I think a friend of mine got that before I did on the regular Genesis, and that was one of my favorite games of all time. I just absolutely loved Sonic the Hedgehog 2. So, yeah, this version just didn't do it for me. Well, if Sonic 2 hinted that there might be something a little off about the Game Gear, This next game, WWF Wrestlemania Steel Cage Challenge, really drove the point home that the Game Gear at its lowest point could be completely miserable. And this game was bad on every platform. These Acclaim Flying Edge wrestling games were terrible, but it really felt like a bad effort on the Game Gear. It was, demonstrably worse than those games on the NES, save for the first WrestleMania game on the NES, which was a disaster, although very nostalgic for me. But this was just bad. This was a bad button masher with no soul in a series of bad button mashers with no soul. So, I played this and I was like, this is one of the first times probably in gaming where I said to myself, I'm going to turn this off. I could play a bad game as a kid, but this was so bad and so repetitive that, I actually went back to that isometric game, WWF, one of the WrestleManias on the NES. And that was a sort of a meaningful point for me because the Game Gear, as it went on, and as I think Sega saw that, hey, this thing really isn't selling the way we hoped, the whole, hey, this is in color, Game Boy isn't, pitch really didn't work. How many units did Game Boy sell? I couldn't even tell you. This Game Gear, I think, probably shifted about 10 million units, which was not what Sega was hoping for. So the games on the Game Gear got progressively lazier, especially the third-party stuff. So I always found myself, saying, hey, I'm going to go back to the Nintendo. And then when I got the TurboGrafx 16, when I got the actual Sega Genesis, there became no reason to turn the Game Gear on. And it wasn't just this game. It was, the Mortal Kombats, which, while better than this, were kind of sloppy. Some of the sports games were a little sloppy. I remember playing a couple of the Marvel games, which I remember not being great. So, yeah, this was the point at which the Game Gear just wasn't getting a lot of use. And it wasn't just the third-party stuff. Take some first-party stuff from Sega, like Streets of Rage and Streets of Rage 2. We're looking at Streets of Rage 2 here, and, it's a respectable game. It's certainly, you can't say that it isn't fun. It's fun to a degree. But if you played Streets of Rage 2 on the Genesis, which arguably the best Genesis game around, and you came to this, obviously it couldn't capture the graphical prowess, it couldn't capture the performance, having all the different characters on screen, but there was a kind of one-dimensionality, or, that's kind of a silly term, I'm talking about two-dimensional games, but, a lack of depth. And Streets of Rage 2 to me was, it was the property, but it was kind of phoned in. It had the weapons, it had similar looking enemies, it reasonably represented the levels, but Streets of Rage is a repetitive game, but there was a kind of heart and soul to Streets of Rage 2 that this one just didn't capture. And I think if you looked at the Game Boy and their approach, okay, it wasn't in color, it was, compared to the Game Gear, a supposedly inferior machine, but what Nintendo did was it, in a lot of instances, reimagined its franchises for the handheld platform, and that evolved into masterpieces like Super Mario 2 on the Game Boy, and then, of course, Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening. Those games weren't trying to be like the console counterparts. They, drew from those, certainly, but they were their own games. And I think the problem with the Game Gear is that Sega just said, well, hey, we've got this successful property on the Genesis, let's make a Game Gear game that copies it, but is just not as good. There wasn't that innovation on the Game Gear. And then you compound that with the fact that, as many people have pointed out, this system was really not portable. I mean, it ate 6 AA batteries so fast. I mean, I remember, my parents giving me like 12 new batteries on a trip and saying, hey, this is what you have for the whole trip. And that didn't last very long. So, you had these games that, for the most part, weren't innovative, and in the case of the third-party games, actually pretty bad. But you had a system that couldn't handle, more than a couple hours of gameplay on the battery. So, as a result, you didn't take it anywhere. And if I have a choice between sitting in my alcove plugged into the wall, or playing the Genesis, or the certainly the SNES, the NES, the TurboGrafx 16, there was no reason to play the Game Gear. Totally different from the Game Boy, which, I got a Game Boy later, but with the Game Boy, I actually, first of all, it was portable, but even at home, I'd sit there and play it in bed with that light magnifying glass thing, and play the Final Fantasy games, and play the Mario games, play the Legend of Zelda. I chose the Game Boy over the home consoles at certain points. I never did that with the Game Gear. And in a certain sense, that was kind of a shame, because the system did improve. You had a number of games, like I'm showing Sonic Chaos. Actually, a friend of mine was big into the Game Gear, and actually, I want to say, was getting close to a complete collection, even back in the day, for whatever reason. Parents bought him every Game Gear game available. So, Sonic Triple Trouble, Sonic Drift, while not a good game, felt kind of innovative. You had the Shining Force game, which I believe came out here. I've only ever played it on the 3DS. So perhaps it was a localization, but that arguably is the best game on the Game Gear. And then, if you look to Japan, they had some good shooters. They had GGLS. They had Power Strike 2, which is a very good game. So there were some gems out there for the system, but I think this is one of the few systems I can say that, especially having gone back to play it recently, I could say, I'm good with never playing these Game Gear games again. I mean, yeah, there's a nostalgia factor to them, and it's certainly a meaningful part of my gaming youth, as it were, but the games just don't hold up, and at least for me. Now, maybe there's a game that I'm forgetting, like I know, or that I haven't played, better yet, like Dynamite Headdy, or Gunstar Heroes, which I think was a Japan-only game, or I think there was a Mega Man, which I never played. There was a Castlevania. It wasn't really Castlevania, but it was like a Castlevania ripoff, or Castlevania clone, I should say, that a lot of people seem to like. So, it could have just been that I didn't play the right games. And there were other games that I did play, like I liked the Shinobi game to a degree. I thought Shinobi was pretty well done on here. But for the most part, I can say that the Game Gear was the only system in my youth that I more or less just put down and stopped caring about. And actually, it was a really funny story. I remember one day I came home from school and my mother was cleaning out the closet, or one of the closets, and at the very bottom of everything, and this was a pretty packed closet, she found the Game Gear in the case, and she was like, well, you don't use this anymore? We spent good money on this. And I had no answer other than that once I got those other systems, there was no reason to play the Game Gear. So I think this is an early example of kind of what killed Sega. It was the, attitude commercials, the over-promising, and, it worked on me to an extent, because after this, I got the Genesis, I got the Sega CD, I didn't have the 32X, but, Sega, for as much time as I spent playing Sega Genesis games as a kid, or Sega games, period, whether it was the Genesis, the Game Gear, or the Sega CD, I always felt somewhat disappointed because they never really lived up to the promises that they were making, and not just them, but also in the magazines and stuff like that. And it seemed like, Nintendo with the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy didn't have the Super Nintendo until very, very late in the life cycle, as you may know, following the channel. But, once I got my hands on the Game Boy, I was really thrilled. It was, one of my favorite systems. So, in a way, I wish Sega had done something differently. I don't know what they could have done differently. I mean, they did miniaturize the Master System, but it was a good experiment. It was, I think, better than the Lynx. I only played the Lynx very sparingly back then, but still was not what I hoped for. And the dream of a portable Genesis died off pretty quickly. So, curious to know what other people think about the Game Gear. Was I not alone on this, or was this kind of the birth of my video game negativity? But nonetheless, like I said, it's in the closet, it still works, and it's still part of my video game nostalgia.